Just a broke nurse, and that mechanic husband of yours doesn't have a dime to his name." My mother spat the words across the dining table, her eyes crawling over my scrubs like she'd found something rotting under the porch. She reached across, snatched the cream envelope right out of my hands, and dropped it onto the floor before grinding her heel into the gold lettering. "Tessa is marrying into the Caldwell family tomorrow. Half the hospital board will be there. I won't have them looking at her sister and seeing a charity case." I stood there in my work clothes, my badge still clipped to my chest, and felt something in me go very still and very cold, the way it does right before you walk into a trauma bay and your hands stop shaking on their own. I picked up my coat. I took my husband's hand. We walked out the door and accepted the exile she handed us. She had no idea that 9 hours after that $100,000 reception, a black SUV would pull into my sister's circular driveway, and the man who stepped out of it would change the temperature of that entire wedding for good. But before I get to that, let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand where it started. I'm 38 years old. I work nights in the ICU at a regional hospital in Ohio, the kind of place where you learn people's whole lives in the 40 minutes before you lose them or save them. My husband Dale fixes transmissions for a living, has grease under his nails that doesn't fully come out even after a shower, and has never once in 12 years of marriage raised his voice at me. My mother has spent those same 12 years referring to him as the mechanic, like it's a diagnosis. My older sister Tessa is the golden one, always has been, ever since we were kids and she'd come home from cheer practice to a kitchen my mother had cleaned just for her arrival, while I came home from my part-time job at the pharmacy to a stack of dishes and a comment about how I tracked dirt onto the carpet. I should say up front that I don't think my mother is a cartoon villain. I think she's a woman who decided a long time ago that love was a transaction, and that her daughters were investments, and somewhere along the way, she put all her money on Tessa and wrote me off as a loss she'd already absorbed. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth, and the truth matters here, because everything that happened after started with that one cold math problem she did in her head decades ago and never once revisited. The wedding invitation showed up on a Tuesday. Tessa was marrying Holt Caldwell, whose family owned about a third of the commercial real estate in our county, and a regional chain of car dealerships besides. The wedding was being thrown at the Caldwell estate, the kind of place with a name, not an address. Larkspur Hill, Ironwork Gates, a guest list that read like the donor wall at the Children's Hospital. My mother had been planning her outfit for 6 weeks. She had not, in those 6 weeks, asked me a single question about my life, my job, my marriage, or whether I was even free that Saturday. I found out about the date because Tessa texted me a save the card photo with 3 exclamation points and nothing else. I want to tell you that I wasn't excited, that I'd already steeled myself for disappointment, but that would be a lie I'm tired of telling myself in hindsight. I was excited. I love my sister, even now, even after everything. That's the complicated part nobody wants to hear in stories like this. I picked out a dress. Dale rented a suit. We drove 40 minutes to my mother's house the Tuesday before the wedding to drop off a gift, a heavy crystal vase. Dale had insisted we couldn't afford and bought anyway, because he wanted my mother to see we showed up with something nice. That's when it happened. We walked in, and my mother was sitting at the dining table with the final guest list spread out in front of her, a pen in her hand, crossing off names like she was doing inventory. She looked up at me, then at Dale, then back at me, and her face did something I'd seen 1,000 times but never gotten used to. A kind of wince, like swallowing something sour. "You're not seriously planning to come in that," she said, looking at my scrubs. I'd come straight from a 12-hour shift. "I'm going home to change first, Mom. I just wanted to drop off the gift." She didn't even look at the box. She looked at Dale's hands, at the black half-moons of grease under his nails that no amount of scrubbing ever fully lifts, and her mouth pulled tight. Half of Holt's family runs in Forbes circles. Do you understand what it would do to Tessa if people thought her own sister couldn't afford a manicure? I felt my face go hot, the way it does in front of a patient's family when you're trying not to let them see you react to something cruel they just said in grief. "Mom, I'm not asking anyone to pay for my nails. I'm asking to come to my sister's wedding." She picked up the envelope, the one with the gold script, the one I'd already RSVP'd 2 weeks ago, and for a second I thought she was going to hand me something. A seating card, maybe, a kind word, anything. Instead, she folded it once, hard, down the middle, the crease tearing slightly through the calligraphy of my own name, and set it face down on the table like she was discarding a losing hand of cards. "I think it would be better," she said, "if you two stayed home. I'll tell Tessa you had a shift you couldn't get out of." I stood there holding a crystal vase my husband couldn't afford, in my work scrubs, badge still clipped to my chest, with a photo of me looking tired and proud the day I got promoted to charge nurse. And I felt 12 years old again. Felt that specific humiliation of being told once again that I was the daughter you apologized for instead of introduced. Dale didn't say a word, that's not his nature. but I felt his hand find the small of my back, steady, the same way it does when we're standing in a hospital hallway waiting on test results neither of us wants to hear. He set the vase down gently on the table like he was setting down a small animal, careful not to make a sound, and then he looked at my mother with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not angry, just finished. "We'll see ourselves out," he said. We didn't argue. I want people to understand that. We didn't beg, didn't make a scene, didn't ask her to reconsider. 20 years of asking had taught me there was nothing on the other side of that conversation worth having. I picked the folded invitation back up off the table, smoothed the crease as best I could with my thumb, and put it in my coat pocket, because some stubborn, wounded part of me still wanted it, even disfigured, even unwanted. In the truck, Dale didn't start the engine right away. He just sat there with his hands on the wheel, looking straight ahead at the porch light. "You okay?" he asked. 2 words, that's Dale's whole vocabulary when something matters too much for more. I wasn't okay, but I told him I was, because some part of me had already started doing what I do at work when a code goes bad, boxing the feeling up, sealing it, dealing with it later, in the parking lot, alone, where nobody has to watch you fall apart. What my mother didn't know, what she had never once bothered to ask in 12 years, was what I actually do for a living beyond nurse. She thought of nursing the way she thought of waitressing, necessary, unglamorous, beneath the family's new aspirations. She had no idea that 18 months earlier, the hospital's ICU had been short 2 doctors during a respiratory surge, and I'd spent 11 hours alongside a contract physician brought in from a level 1 trauma center in Columbus, running codes back to back, the 2 of us moving around each other like we'd worked together for years instead of one brutal week. She had no idea that physician and I had stayed in touch, that she'd gone on to direct a regional health network spanning 4 counties, that she still called me sometimes just to ask my read on a patient, because she trusted my eye more than half the residents she supervised. My mother didn't know any of that because she'd never asked. She'd decided who I was at 17 and never updated the file. Her name was Dr. Renata Okafor, and she was going to matter a great deal to what happened next, though I had no idea that Saturday when I sat at home in my work clothes instead of a wedding dress. The morning of the wedding, I didn't go. I sat on our back porch with a cup of coffee, going cold in my hands, and watched Dale work on a neighbor's truck in the driveway, just to have something to look at besides the clock. Around 11, Tessa texted me a single line, "Where are you? The car is sending photos to the group chat, and Mom said you couldn't make it because of work." I didn't answer right away. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't start a fight on her wedding day, and despite everything, I didn't want to be the reason anything went wrong for her. So I just texted back, "Have the most beautiful day," and put the phone face down on the porch railing. The reception was at Larkspur Hill, under a clear October sky, 200 and some guests, a sit-down dinner, an ice sculpture, the whole production. I know all this because Tessa posted it in real time, and because of what I learned later from people who were there. The cocktail hour ran long, the toasts ran longer. My mother gave one of those toasts, the kind where she talked more about herself than about the bride, about the sacrifices she'd made, about raising a daughter who'd risen above their modest beginnings, about how proud she was that Tessa had found a family that matched the family she'd always known they deserved. Nobody in that room knew she had another daughter sitting 40 minutes away in sweatpants. As far as that room was concerned, Tessa was an only child. It was around 9 that night, while the band was playing and the dance floor was full, that the black SUV came up the long gravel drive past the valet stand, no headlights flashing, just steady and unhurried, and parked at an angle that made 2 of the valet attendants step back without quite knowing why. Dr. Renata Okafor stepped out in a navy dress, flat shoes, her hospital network badge still clipped to her bag out of habit, because she'd come straight from a hospital board, fundraising dinner 3 towns over, and had a confession to make to a friend before the night was over. She found Tessa near the gift table and asked, politely, where she might find Tessa's sister. She had something for me she'd meant to drop off weeks ago and kept missing me. Tessa, to her credit, looked confused rather than alarmed. "She's not here. She had work." It was my mother who appeared at Renata's elbow a moment later, smiling the smile she reserves for anyone she suspects might be important, and asked, with the particular brightness she uses on strangers with money, whether she could help. "I'm looking for my colleague," Renata said. "We worked a respiratory surge together at County General about a year and a half ago. I wanted to thank her in person. She's the reason I changed how we staff nights across the whole network, saved more lives than she'll ever take credit for. I heard her sister was getting married tonight and thought I'd surprise her." My mother's face did something I wish I'd been there to see. Though I've had it described to me twice now in enough detail that I can picture it perfectly. That particular freeze a person gets when 2 separate stories they've been telling collide in real time in front of an audience that matters. "I'm sorry," my mother said slowly. "Who exactly is your colleague?" Her sister, Renata said, nodding at Tessa, who was standing right there in her wedding dress. Marisol Reyes. Well, I suppose it's a different name now, married name. Charge nurse, County General ICU. One of the best clinicians I've ever worked beside, and I've worked beside a lot of them. That's me, Marisol. I should say that now, since I haven't yet. Marisol Reyes Whitfield, since I took Dale's name, though Renata's always called me by my maiden name out of old habit from the chart we first worked off of together. My mother, I'm told, laughed a little laugh that didn't reach her eyes and said something about how I must have been confused about the schedule, that I'd had a shift family emergencies happen, you understand. Renata, who has never in her life let an inconsistency go unexamined, tilted her head and said she found that strange, since she happened to know my schedule that week. She'd called the unit looking for me that very morning to confirm a consult, and they'd told her I was off through the weekend. By then, a small cluster of guests had drifted close enough to hear, the way people do at weddings when they sense something interesting happening near the gift table. Holt's father, who sat on 3 hospital boards across 2 states, recognized Renata's name before anyone explained who she was, walked over, shook her hand warmly, and said something about how thrilled he was to finally meet the woman behind the network's new sepsis protocol everyone in his circles had been talking about. Renata thanked him, and then, because she is who she is, added conversationally, I just wish I'd known sooner that her family was hosting tonight. I'd have loved to actually meet Marisol's mother and sister properly. She talks about them so rarely, I sometimes forget she has any family at all. I wasn't there. I didn't see my mother's face go through whatever it went through, standing in the middle of that conversation, in front of the people she'd spent the whole night performing for, realizing in real time that the daughter she'd erased from existence 20 minutes earlier had quietly become the reason a respected physician was standing on her other daughter's dance floor, saying complimentary things about a hospital network half the room's money was tangled up in. What I do know is that by 9:40, my phone started buzzing on the porch railing, and it didn't stop. The first call was from Tessa. I almost didn't pick up, then I did, and I heard music and voices behind her, and her voice was strange, tight, somewhere between confused and something I hadn't heard from my sister in a long time, which I can only describe now as shame. Why didn't you tell me? She said, no greeting, that you basically run the night shift at one of the biggest hospital systems in the state. Why didn't you tell me, doctor? Okafor. Mari, she's standing right here. She came looking for you. She's talking about you to Holt's dad like you're some kind of legend, and Mom is just standing here not saying anything. Her voice cracked. Why does it feel like I don't know my own sister? I sat very still on that porch, the coffee long gone cold, Dale's silhouette still bent over the truck in the driveway, and for a second I didn't know how to answer her, because the honest answer was, because nobody in our family had ever asked. I have to go, Tessa said before I could find words. I have to go find Mom. The second call an hour later was from my mother. I almost let that one go to voicemail too, old reflex, but something made me pick it up. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest about that, because there's a version of this story where she calls in tears and begs forgiveness. And I don't want to oversell what actually happened. What she said, in a voice I'd never heard her use with me, careful, almost formal, was, Doctor. Okafor seems to think very highly of you. She does, I said. You never mentioned any of this. You never asked, Mom. In 12 years, you've asked me exactly twice what I do at work, and both times you changed the subject before I finished answering. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I could hear the band still playing somewhere behind her, something slow now, the kind of song people dance their last dance to. I think, she said finally, you should have come tonight. And there it was, the closest thing to an admission I was ever going to get, dressed up as a logistic complaint instead of an apology, the same way she'd dressed up exclusion as practicality for 20 years. I felt something in my chest that I want to describe honestly, because I think it's the part of this story people relate to most. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't even anger, not in that moment. It was just tired. A bone-deep tired, the kind you feel at hour 11 of a shift, when you finally sit down and realize your legs have been shaking for a while without you noticing. I would have liked to come, I said. You didn't want me there until I turned out to be useful to you. That's not the same thing as wanting me there. She didn't argue. That's the part that still surprises me when I tell this story out loud. She just went quiet, and then said she had to get back to the reception, and hung up. I didn't go to Larkspur Hill that night, and I want to correct a version of this story that might be forming in your head right now, because this isn't one of those tales where the wrong daughter shows up in a red dress to make a scene and everyone applauds. That's not what happened, and honestly, it's not who I am. I stayed on my porch with Dale, who'd finished with the truck by then and come to sit beside me, smelling like motor oil and dish soap, and we ate cold leftover pasta out of the pot because neither of us felt like dirtying 2 dishes. And I told him everything Tessa and my mother had said, And he listened the way he always does, without trying to fix it, just absorbing it alongside me so I wouldn't have to carry the whole weight by myself. The wedding ended the way weddings end. The real ending, the one that mattered, happened over the following weeks. Tessa called me 3 days later, not to talk about the wedding, but to ask if she could come over. She showed up at our place, a small rental 2 towns over from my mother's house, the kind of place with a chain-link fence and a window unit instead of central air, the kind of place my mother had never once visited in 4 years. And she sat at our kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg Dale keeps meaning to fix, and she cried in a way I hadn't seen since we were kids and our father left. "I've spent my whole life thinking I was the one who made something of herself," she said, "and the entire time, you were the one actually saving people. And I didn't even know what hospital you worked at. I had to find that out from a stranger at my own wedding." I didn't comfort her right away. I want to be honest about that too, because I think pretending I felt nothing but grace in that moment would be its own kind of lie. I let her to sit in it for a minute, let the silence stretch, because 20 years of being the invisible daughter had earned me at least that much. Then I got up, put the kettle on, the way you do, and told her the truth. That I didn't blame her, not really, not for choices our mother made before either of us was old enough to push back on them. I blamed the math my mother had done decades ago and never bothered to redo, even when the numbers stopped making sense. My mother never called to apologize, not properly, not in so many words. What she did instead, over the following months, was something stranger, and in some ways more honest. She started asking questions. Small ones at first, awkward ones, like someone learning a language late in life. "How's the unit short-staffed again this winter? Did that surge ever let up?" She started, slowly, clumsily, treating my job like it was real, like it had weight, the way she'd always treated Tessa's life. "I won't tell you we're close now." That would be a tidier ending than the one I actually got, and I've grown suspicious of tidy endings since all this happened. What I'll tell you is that 6 months later, when my mother needed a hip replacement, I was the one who sat with her in pre-op, the one who read her chart and asked her surgeon questions Tessa wouldn't have known to ask, the one whose hand she gripped when the anesthesia started pulling her under. She looked up at me right before she went out and said, in a voice thinned by fear and the first dose of sedative, "I should have come to your work once, just once. I never even saw where you save people." I told her there was still time, and there was, and there has been. She's visited the unit twice since then, stood awkwardly by the nurse's station in her good coat, watched me work a code from a respectful distance, and afterward, in the parking lot, told me quietly that she didn't understand how I did what I did, and that she was sorry it took so long to ask. I think about that crumpled invitation sometimes, the one I picked back up off her dining table and smoothed with my thumb, the crease still visible through my own name no matter how many times I've tried to flatten it. I kept it. It's in a drawer in our kitchen, under the takeout menus and the spare keys, not because I need the reminder of how she treated me, but because I need the reminder of how far we both had to travel to get to the version of us that exists now, imperfect, late, and real instead of performed. Dale still fixes transmissions. I still work nights. Neither of us has ever needed a black SUV or a hospital network or anyone else's recognition to know what we're worth to each other. And that, more than anything that happened at Larkspur Hill, is the thing I actually want you to take from this. The people who love you without conditions were never the ones keeping score in the first place. The ones who suddenly start being kind once they learn what you're worth on paper were never loving you to begin with. They were just recalculating, the way my mother did, the way I imagine a lot of people watching this have had someone in their own life do to them. If that's you, I hope you find your own version of that quiet kitchen table, your own person who sits beside you without needing a reason, and I hope, eventually, you find a little peace with whoever taught you that love had to be earned in the first place. Even if, like me, that peace takes years longer than you ever wanted it to.